You are going to want to stick around for the next 2 hours because have we got a fascinating show for you. Carl Goldman with you here on AM 1220 KHTS 98.1 FM. And within the next 2 hours, we're going to have 3 of the top doctors in the country calling in who are experts on coronavirus and the vaccine. And so you really want to stick around to learn more about some of the challenges that the vaccine might face. With us right now, I'm pleased to announce we have Laura Sextro, who's the CEO of the Unity Project. And if you Google this and check it out, you'll see that the Unity Project is quite an organization that got established right as COVID-19 started out. And Laura, I'll let you take it away and talk a little bit about how the Unity Project came about and what you're doing today.
Wow, fantastic. Thanks for having me, Carl. I appreciate it. So Unity Project started about 8 months ago now. We were faced with this option of what do you do in terms of your children, because the vaccines were just starting to be deployed into the human population. They're still, to this day, they're still under an emergency use authorization. So there's no actually FDA-approved vaccine for COVID-19. We know, and we now know, there's a tremendous amount of data coming out from the Pfizer documents as well as the VAERS information. That's the vaccine injured reporting system. That these vaccines come with a tremendous amount of risk. In addition to that, we also know that the pediatric population is not at risk. So if you look at that risk-benefit analysis, it's just all risk and no benefit. And we know that the pediatric population, they're not vectors of transmission. And just for point of clarification, pediatric being defined as anyone under the age of 18. So to this day, there's never been a healthy child under the age of 18 that has passed away of COVID. However, we have tremendous amount of documentation of vaccine injured as well as, sadly, mortality in the pediatric population. So fast forward, we are faced with this choice of we either have to send our kids to school, get them vaccinated, or take a stand against this for parental rights and medical freedom. And so we formed the Unity Project, knowing that there are hundreds of groups across the state of California, across the country, and across the world that are fighting vaccine mandates. And we're also doing it in a very disparate way, right? So you have groups in certain counties that are doing it, and they're doing it in their way, and then you've got groups in maybe another county, and they're doing it another way, and they're all issuing their own calls to action, but no one's speaking in a unified voice. And so Unity Project was formed with the attempt, and I think we've been fairly successful, and we continue to, but the attempt to be a conduit of collaboration and communication for all the grassroots organizations that are taking a stand against these vaccine mandates. Also to help educate, our Chief Medical Officer is Dr. Robert Malone. Our Chief of Medical Ethics is Dr. Aaron Cariotti, who I know we're very excited about. And our Chief Scientific Officer is Dr. Paul Alexander. And of course, on our Strategic Advisory Council, we have doctors like Dr. Pierre Corey, Dr. Peter McCullough, and so on.
And we're going to have Dr. Pierre Corey and Dr. Paul Alexander and Dr. Cariotti on the air with us over the course of the next 2 hours.
That's correct, yeah.
I've been pretty transparent about my situation, and we're going to talk more about that later on with one of the doctors. But for those of you just tuning in or don't know my story, in 2019, I took a vaccine, the shingles vaccine, the newer version of the shingles vaccine, Shingrix, which is a type of mRNA, which is the same technology that COVID is using, at least for Pfizer and for Moderna.
That's correct.
And about 2 weeks later, I started having a reaction to it. 3 weeks into it, I took a flight from here to Salt Lake City. My feet fell asleep on the plane. They never woke up. And I was an avid skier prior to that, avid mountain biker, and spent most of 2020 in a wheelchair and am still in recovery and am paralyzed from the feet down, all because of the vaccine. And we learned, as doctors poo-pooed it, just like they're doing today with a different vaccine, in 2021, in fact, on March 24th, and you can Google this, even Google hasn't blocked this. On March 24th of 2021, the FDA finally came out with a warning on the shingles vaccine because it creates a chance of getting Guillain-Barré, similar to what I had, and there are tens of thousands of people like me. And I guess we're learning that now with the COVID vaccine. There are tens, 20, 30,000, if not more,
I think there's a lot more.
a lot more.
I think there's a lot more. And the sad thing is that we're living in a world where we know that this data exists. We know that that there are dangers, but for the people that are in the situation that you're in, it's very difficult to get a diagnosis. So there's a lot of people that are out there that are suffering, and they're not sure why, and they're not getting to the right medical care. And then once they feel confident and they have gotten a diagnosis, getting doctors to be able to treat these patients, that's a whole separate journey. Right, and I'm sure you're experiencing that.
Exactly, and that's becoming tougher now because there's some devious bills here in California. California seems to be off the charts when it comes to COVID compared to most of the other states around the country. But right now, as we speak, up in Sacramento, there are some bills that would make George Orwell turn over in his grave, dealing with freedom of speech and, more importantly, vaccines and forced vaccines on kids.
Right.
And I'm wondering, Laura, if you could talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. It feels like we are for sure living in a dystopian society right now. We've got bills like SB 866 that are on the horizon. They continue to move the hearing dates. But for those people who have no idea about SB 866, that is a bill that essentially will allow a 12-year-old to make their own medical decisions without the knowledge or consent of their parent. And I find that just to be there's so many layers of this being incredibly devious on the part of the government. First and foremost, we don't want the government that's the total breakdown of the nuclear family, right? That then becomes the government co-parenting your children. In addition to that, what I find to be interesting is in society nowadays, you can't go out and get your children's ears pierced without giving parental consent. At a school, if your child has a headache, you have to give parent consent and authorization to administer an over-the-counter drug like Tylenol or Advil. What I'm finding in California as well, I get feedback from teenagers all the time that they're 15, 16, 17 years old and they're looking to get a job. They're not allowed to get a job. Most companies will not hire you until you're 18 years old. Yet the state of California is looking to give these children the ability to make and engage in medical decisions that could alter their life irreparably, or potentially end their life, as we've seen in some sad cases. I know Ernesto Jr. is a teenager who's 15 years old. He died 5 days after having they had the COVID-19 vaccine administered to him. And then you have bills like 2098, which this one to me is probably one of the most dangerous bills because it will represent, I think, the total destruction of medicine in this country. And what it states is that any doctor that is, and I'm paraphrasing, but any doctor that goes against the COVID narrative will be subject to having their license under review and their licenses taken away. And that is, as Dr. Aaron Cariotti will talk about, that's akin to a lawyer being disbarred. So they will never practice medicine again. So you're creating a state through these bills where doctors will be practicing medicine in a state of fear. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to go to a doctor and know that everything that I'm having, any interaction that I'm having with my doctor is overshadowed by the thought that this doctor has to think of everything that they're saying because they're concerned that their license is going to be under review.
And as I understand the bill, it's a lot broader than just doctors. So dentists, physical therapists, nurses,
integrative medicine.
Anyone. So someone who is a physical therapist who might have their own practice, could lose everything they've got. Chiropractors, another version.
And you brought up a really interesting point. It's because it's so overarching and broad in the language, and I think by design. You have this environment where this is the door that's being opened to now all forms of integrative medicine, all forms of medical practice that goes outside of what the government deems, or in particular, the pharmaceutical community deems as the appropriate medical pathway. All forms of medicine will then be shut down. And this is the starting point to that. It feels so. You mentioned Orwellian. It feels to me. It almost feels something like the Gestapo, circa 1945, and it's quite scary.
And to make matters worse, guess who gets to decide what misinformation is?
The government.
The government. And in California, it would be the health department
That's right.
here in the state that would make the decision on what's correct information, the right information, what's misinformation.
That's correct. California Department of Health.
There's a great book out. It was written by Michael Lewis, who's one of my favorite authors, and he's liberal. He wrote a book on the pandemic and had about 5 different heroes, one of whom treated me because I was one of the first Americans to get COVID because my wife and I were on the Diamond Princess, but that's some other show. But one of the heroes treated me when I was with the CDC for a month in Nebraska. But he identifies a hero who's was a female head of the Department of Health in Santa Barbara, got moved up to the second in command position in the state under Jerry Brown. And the first in command decided she was going to retire when Jerry Brown left office. And so number 2 was being groomed for it. And number 2, again, according to Michael Lewis, was one of the heroes in all this. When Newsom took over, he decided that having a mid-40-year-old blonde head was not good optics. So he chose someone of a different ethnic background out of New York who had no business being the head of health.
Right.
And I heard from various people afterwards, after I read this from Michael Lewis's book, that she was a total off the charts, a total nut. Should not have been put in that position. And so we found, being California, during the COVID epidemic, found that the person in charge of all policy, health policy in the state, was not qualified to be in there. And it wasn't until 8 or 9 months into it that Newsom realized that she was a train wreck and finally fired her. But again, had we if we could rewind the tape and had number 2 in charge, we might have handled this a lot differently in California.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that things potentially could be a lot different. And going to your point about not being qualified, and I know Dr. Aaron Cariotti will speak to this point, but I think people don't understand that the CDC and the California Department of Health, NIH, all these other, 3-letter acronyms for the federal government or even the state government, they are not medical institutions. They are not medical doctors that are looking at individual patients and diagnosing and understanding the best pathway. What they're doing is they're regulatory organizations and some of them are not even medical doctors, and they are looking at the overall society and suggesting regulatory information and protocols for the overall society. And so this kind of one-size-fits-all approach. And the other thing that's really scary, there's a bill. If you go to www.unityproject.com, you can see all of the bills. But there's a bill that now will state, it's up for a vote, that currently California Department of Health, they are not elected officials, right? They are a governing body. They do not make laws. But according to this bill, should this bill pass, any CDPH regulation will be enforced by law enforcement in order for law enforcement to receive any state funding. So think about that for a second, what you just said about someone who's not qualified, but now making regulations that law enforcement will be required to enforce.
Those words of wisdom coming from Laura Sextro, who's the CEO of the Unity Project. She's here with us on KHTS, AM 1220, FM 98.1. I'm Carl Goldman. When we come back, we're going to talk to who I consider one of the heroes in this whole COVID story, and that's Dr. Pierre Kory, and he'll be joining us in a minute or so. So stay with us. You don't want to miss it.
Do you suffer from peripheral neuropathy in your hands or feet? One drug after another, continuing numbness, tingling, burning pain, balance problems, decreased quality of life? Are you experimenting with drugs like Lyrica, Neurontin, gabapentin, Cymbalta with limited success and your doctor telling you just have to live with it? My name is Dr. Thomas Pilecki, DC, host of Get Better with Dr. Pilecki and founder of Neuropathy Dr. X. I'm here to tell you that there is now a non-invasive natural solution to your neuropathy right here in Santa Clarita, a solution that addresses the underlying causes, and we're proud to say that we have an 87 to 97% success rate with neuropathy sufferers in getting their lives back. I'd like to invite you to our next seminar, when we'll teach you how to reverse this deadly condition that affects over 50 million Americans today. To reserve your spot now, call 753-9340. This is a free seminar, but seating is limited, so call 753-9340 now.
Helping lead the way to a greener future, all of Burtech's Santa Clarita Valley waste collection trucks run on clean burning natural gas. Burtech takes pride in their community, and they've been serving the SCV for nearly 2 decades. Because at Burtech, we'll take care of it.
It's painful when your teenager in your household is out of control. Out of control behavior is your teen's way of telling you something is wrong. Sometimes the reason for your teen's out of control behavior is so personal and tragic your teen would never tell you or anyone else. Actions speak louder than words. Action Drug Rehab can help. With compassionate individual counseling, group sessions, and family support, Action Drug Rehab has been caring for thousands of Santa Clarita teens for decades. Visit actiondrugrehab.com. Get help now.
Did you know dog waste left on the ground contains harmful bacteria that can wash into the Santa Clara River? Pollution can create health and environmental hazards in the city of Santa Clarita. When picking up after your pet, use a bag, tie it, and place it in a regular trash container. It's your duty to bag dog duty, and your Santa Clarita neighbors will appreciate it. Learn more at greensantaclarita.com.
Yes, 98.1 FM, AM 1220. Carl Goldman with you, along with Laura Sextro, who's the CEO of the Unity Project. You're going to want to Google this, or actually go on, forget Google. Go on a variety of different search engines and look for the Unity Project, or just go on your browser, theunityproject.com. And we were chatting about some of the devious things that are taking place in California, but this really is a national problem, Laura. And I know there's an interesting book that you shared with me a few minutes ago that I now put on my must-read list.
Yes.
But why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was mailed this book by Dr. Colleen Huber. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. It's called Neither Safe Nor Effective. And
And that title is taken because the tagline for the COVID vaccine is safe and effective.
Safe and effective. I mean, it's the mantra.
Right.
And so I thought it was actually an interesting play on words. And, I've been in this, I've been researching quite a bit, and this is probably one of the best, most succinct, most clear representation of the concerns and dangers with these vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines, that is, that I've read. And I'll just read you an excerpt just to give you kind of a little preview from the book. So she says, more deaths and injuries have now been reported on VAERS following the COVID vaccines in just 1 year of use than for all other vaccines combined over the last 30 years of reporting. That's pretty shocking. And she goes on to say that new drugs are generally pulled immediately from the market in the U.S. per FDA standards after 50 deaths. But yet they continue to deploy these vaccines. Another excerpt and statistic that I thought was just shocking was that the U.S. military has experienced an 1,100% increase in deaths in one of the youngest and fittest cohorts in the U.S. population. That's just a couple of excerpts from the book. But, I highly encourage if people to go out and look this book up. I think you can get it on Amazon, Neither Safe Nor Effective by Dr. Colleen Huber. And it's this book, I hope, and I think it's her intent as well, could potentially save lives. One of the things that it's astonishing to me is that when you talk about just about anything that you do in your day-to-day life, whether it's, when you go to the gas station, you want to know what octane gas you're going to buy, right? If you go to the grocery store, you buy a box of cereal, the list of ingredients is there. Yet to this day, we do not have informed consent with these vaccines. We do not know what is contained in the vaccines. And it's astonishing to me because you've got Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical companies fighting aggressively, digging their heels in, and only releasing information under court order.
Right. Pfizer wanted to have the information stored for 99 years or
75 years.
75 years before it got released.
75 years.
It's interesting. At the top of the hour in the newscast, John Hinckley Jr., for those who are too young to remember, was the one who shot President Reagan at the time, got released, and it will be released without any ramifications now. But I just finished reading a book on James Garfield, who was president about 20 years after the Civil War. And what's interesting is he got shot very similar to Reagan. And if he was shot 15 years later, he would have easily lived. But he died with 90 days of horrible treatment by doctors because they didn't believe in germs or anesthetics or cleanliness. And they were given that information because 15 years prior to that, which was our centennial, Europe had already switched over because Louis Pasteur and Dr. Lister in Britain had been advocates, Pasteur discovering germs and Lister really changing the whole way we do operations and stuff with antiseptics and sterilizing everything. They came to the centennial in Philadelphia, and all the leading surgeons from the East Coast were there, from Johns Hopkins, from Harvard. They gave a full presentation, and the doctors said, there's no such thing as germs if you can't see them. Wow. So this country, while Europe had already adapted to germs and everything else some 7 years prior to the centennial, it took us till the turn of the century to switch. And I think we're in that same situation now.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at what's happening right now in Europe and some of these other countries, you're seeing all these COVID restrictions and testing requirements being eased. And yet seems like we are ratcheting up with what's going on. I mean, we have bills right now, 871, it's been put on hold, but potentially could be resurrected, which say children cannot go to school without being vaccinated. I mean, it feels very much like the rest of the world is starting to recognize that COVID is not as difficult in terms of a virus to recover from. There is a very small subset of society that's impacted. You have to be elderly, you have to have extreme comorbidities. The pediatric population is totally risk-free from the virus. So the rest of the world, it seems like, is understanding this, but the U.S., it seems like we're going full force, putting the foot on the gas pedal of all this crazy COVID vaccine mandates.
And we're being censored for it. It'll be very interesting to see. We put all of our broadcasts up on YouTube without any issues. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with this broadcast being put on YouTube. We'll have other vehicles for people to hear this over and over again in the podcast. The audio podcast will be put on our website. We're chatting with Laura Sextro, who's the CEO of the Unity Project. It's theunityproject.com that you want to check out. Carl Goldman here with you on KHTS, AM 1220, FM 98.1. Dr. Pierre Corey is going to be joining us in a minute or two. But I thought we might take a minute or so. You have a podcast yourself that you've added onto the Unity Project. And today I happen to watch one that was very inspiring for a woman who I'm going to get to meet in a week. I'm very excited about
Yeah.
it, Bree. But she started a whole organization, nonprofit organization for people who've been injured by vaccines. As I understand it, she had signed up for the initial study when the vaccines were before they were released to the general public, had a bad reaction to it, along with many, many, many others, and then took a journey to the NIH, the National Institute of Health. And why don't you pick it up from there?
Yeah, she actually fought very hard and got the NIH to acknowledge and put in writing that her injury was directly correlated and caused by the COVID-19 vaccine. And I believe she was in the AstraZeneca trial. Maddie DeGaria, I believe, might have been Pfizer. There were several others that are, to this day, extremely vaccine injured. She suffers tremendously. She can barely stand up for a few hours at a time. And she runs React 19. It's an organization that helps people that have been injured by the vaccine. It helps them find medical care because, again, like we discussed at the beginning of the show, in your own situation, it's extremely difficult for individuals to even get acknowledgement, let alone care. And Bree is doing tremendous work. She, her journey is interesting because she went in with totally benevolent, I think, intentions, where she wanted to help society. She knew that she was following COVID-19 based on how the media is presenting it to the general population, and felt like it was her obligation as a citizen of this country and of the human race to do what she could to help. She was a preschool teacher, totally healthy, enrolled herself in the trial. And one of the things that you'll hear and read about when if you read Neither Safe Nor Effective, is that in the clinical trials with animals as it relates to the COVID vaccines, every single one of those animal trials failed, right? So think about that for a second. Before you can even deploy a trial into the human population, you have to have had success in the animal trials. So she was actually lied to, and so were the other participants, because it should never have even gotten to the point where we have clinical trials on the human population, because it's failing 100% in the animal population. And now she's in the situation that she's in.
And they, according to her, they have not listed her or her peers as being vaccine victims.
That's correct. Yeah. So the NIH is acknowledging it. And AstraZeneca, Pfizer, if you look through these documents, they're not even listed in these documents. So it's just it's a complete lie, because what they're doing is they're actually falsifying data. And in fact, it's talked about here in this book that a lot of the data is actually falsified because and I'm actually going to read directly out of the book. They're falsifying data by unblinding patients, being slow to follow up on adverse events, mislabeled laboratory specimens, and targeting and firing of staff or reporting these types of problems. And in addition to that, actually withholding information and in the documents from Pfizer.
And am I right that she has about 40,000 other vaccine injured people as part of her group now on her social media page?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's growing. It's growing. So one of the things that we talked about in our conversation is how shocking that is, because these are the people that know they're vaccine injured. They're seeking out the answers. Think about the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people that are out there around the globe that have been administered these vaccines and are suffering in silence. She talks about a lot of them that unfortunately she hasn't even been able to reach, and they end up committing suicide out of pure just desperation, because they have been suffering for so long and they're not getting the help that they need.
And there are also, of course, people who aren't around anymore who've died from the vaccine. You just read the numbers a few minutes ago, Laura, on the military alone. So that 40,000 are people who know about her and who have lived to join a Facebook group and work on this. The website for her is react19.org, I believe.
That's
I just
correct.
glanced at the website. It looked fascinating, so I want to dive into that as well. What are some of the other interesting podcasts you've done?
Oh, thanks for asking. So we have spoken to Dr. Pierre Corey, Dr. Paul Alexander, Dr. Aaron Cariotti. The one that was really fascinating that we've gotten a lot of reaction to is Nurse Erin. Now, Nurse Erin has a fascinating background. She's a former Army vet. She was a nurse attached to Special Forces and the Army Rangers. She was in Afghanistan. She came back to the United States after being deployed. COVID hits, and she's working as a nurse in Florida. And all of a sudden, she starts seeing all these nurses getting furloughed. And that was a bit of a red flag because if you think about it, why are nurses getting furloughed during a pandemic? And then they had all these traveling nurses coming in because they were getting FEMA money. So she tells the story, her story of how she ended up volunteering to become a traveling nurse. She gets sent to Elmhurst. Elmhurst was essentially ground zero. If everyone,
That's right outside of New York.
yes, so in New York. So if you remember on the news, you were seeing the freezer trucks with the body bags. Well, that's where Erin was. And she talks about the unfortunate protocol. And let me back up and say that, when she was in Florida, she was very successfully treating her patients. She had 100% of her patients survive from COVID. And she was using very effective early treatment protocols. She goes to New York. They take away those protocols and they start to employ a protocol that is, as she will tell, is 100% fatal. So if you're testing positive for COVID, you get sedated, you get put on a ventilator, and then you're given remdesivir. And she lost 100% of her patients. So that one was one that was particularly eye-opening for me. We also spoke to Matt Boudreau, who has a fascinating background. He actually was a Stanford professor and has worked in almost every facet of education. And he talks about what's happening in the schools today and some alternative options for parents that don't want to have their children in the mainstream school system nowadays because of all the things that our kids are being faced with and kind of forced down their throats.
And the protocols were taken away, not necessarily because the government wanted to kill people, but they had a financial interest because, as I understand it, if there was a protocol that could be proven to be effective in fighting COVID, then it would not be possible to put the vaccines in the fast track with an emergency declaration.
Yeah.
So that they took away they went out of their way to make sure that the protocols were horse medicine and
Sure.
other fallacies that kept it away from being part of the mainstream so that
Right.
the vaccine could have a fast track to get put in.
Right, that's correct. And obviously, when we get Pierre joining us today, I'm sure he'll help give some more clarification on that. But as I understand it, under an emergency use authorization for drugs, if you have any drug that's available on the market, even if it's not dedicated to that particular ailment, then you cannot move forward with an emergency use authorization. And the drugs that are on the market right now, they're being used. They're off label. Meaning that that's not their intended pharmaceutical use, but there's been tremendous amount of clinical trials showing the success for different treatments. So even though they're off-label, they're proving to be incredibly effective and life-saving. And there's actually studies that have been done in Brazil and in India and other countries that are fascinating, where these early effective treatments were deployed into a population, and those populations virtually saw no COVID. And then, of course, you contrast that against what we're doing here in the U.S., and you look at the catastrophic, devastating fatality rates that we've had.
Right, it's insane. And as I mentioned earlier, Jerry and I were on the Diamond Princess. I got COVID. The two of us got flown to CDC headquarters in Omaha after spending a month in quarantine in Japan. And then we spent an additional month over with the CDC right at the beginning of COVID. We're talking late February, early March of 2020. And so we were embedded with the CDC doing lots of clinical studies and having conference calls with all of them daily. There were 16 of us. And what we were getting fed information-wise on COVID early on, it turned 180 degrees
Right.
after the presidential election started getting heated up, and Biden against Trump, it became politicized. And so you had the CDC doing an entire 180 degree from what they had and told us early on. And it had nothing to do with them getting more information as time went on. It had to do with politics.
That's right. Yeah. This has clearly become very politically charged. And it's unfortunate because, look, I think it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, unless you're someone that is so extremely in alignment with certain radical ideologies. So even if you're, we get people, by the way, Unity Project is not a partisan group. We are totally nonpartisan. We have people that are Democrats, we have people that are Republican, Libertarian, everywhere in between. So what that tells me is no matter where you are on the political spectrum, there are certain core tenets that you can agree on. One would be, going back to the bills that are happening today, that a 12-year-old probably it's not a good idea to have them making their own medical decisions, right? Another would be that no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you probably want your doctor to be able to engage in the practice of medicine in accordance with the Hippocratic Oath, right? And their fiduciary duty to their patients. So sadly, though, there are certain, I think, entities, I think the media, probably being one of them, has really led the charge in making this a political response versus something where we're looking at epidemiology and trying to understand human disease and how to get out ahead of it.
We're going to take a short break, but before we do, and actually when we come back, we're going to talk about what you can do to help fight some of the devious bills that we've talked about. We're chatting with Laura Sextro, who's the CEO of the Unity Project. UnityProject.com is what you want to check out. I'm Carl Goldman. HometownStation.com. We'll be posting this interview later today on HometownStation.com, where we won't get canceled. But we're going to take a break for commercials right now. Be right back.
Do you suffer from peripheral neuropathy in your hands or feet? One drug after another, continuing numbness, tingling, burning pain, balance problems, decreased quality of life? Are you experimenting with drugs like Lyrica, Neurontin, gabapentin, Cymbalta with limited success and your doctor telling you just have to live with it? My name is Dr. Thomas Pilecki, DC, host of Get Better with Dr. Pilecki and founder of Neuropathy Dr. X. I'm here to tell you that there is now a non-invasive natural solution to your neuropathy right here in Santa Clarita, a solution that addresses the underlying causes, and we're proud to say that we have an 87 to 97% success rate with neuropathy sufferers in getting their lives back. I'd like to invite you to our next seminar, when we'll teach you how to reverse this deadly condition that affects over 50 million Americans today. To reserve your spot now, call 753-9340. This is a free seminar, but seating is limited, so call 753-9340 now.
Helping lead the way to a greener future, all of Burtech's Santa Clarita Valley waste collection trucks run on clean burning natural gas. Burtech takes pride in their community, and they've been serving the SCV for nearly 2 decades. Because at Burtech, we'll take care of it.
It's painful when your teenager in your household is out of control. Out of control behavior is your teen's way of telling you something is wrong. Sometimes the reason for your teen's out of control behavior is so personal and tragic, your teen would never tell you or anyone else. Actions speak louder than words. Action Drug Rehab can help. With compassionate individual counseling, group sessions, and family support, Action Drug Rehab has been caring for thousands of Santa Clarita teens for decades. Visit actiondrugrehab.com. Get help now.
Did you know dog waste left on the ground contains harmful bacteria that can wash into the Santa Clara River? Pollution can create health and environmental hazards in the city of Santa Clarita. When picking up after your pet, use a bag, tie it, and place it in a regular trash container. It's your duty to bag dog duty, and your Santa Clarita neighbors will appreciate it. Learn more at greensantaclarita.com.
KHTS Radio, AM 1220, FM 98.1. Carl Goldman with you. My pleasure to have Laura Sextro in the studio, who's the CEO of the Unity Project. And we mentioned early on that we're going to have 3 of the heroes of this COVID journey on the air with us, and one is on the line right now, Dr. Pierre Corey, and it's a pleasure to meet you. And Laura, I'll let you say hi to him.
Absolutely. Hi, doctor. How are you?
Hi, Laura.
Thanks for
Nice to
joining
see you guys.
us.
Thanks.
You know what? For those of the people who are listening who don't know you, which I'm always surprised if there's someone who doesn't know Dr. Pierre Corey. He's been leading the charge in this and actually testified in the Senate. And so for those of you who don't know him, maybe, Pierre, if you could just do a quick introduction of yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a lung and ICU specialist. I was a former chief of the critical care service and medical director of the ICU at the University of Wisconsin. But in COVID, I co-founded the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, and we've simply dedicated ourselves to trying to develop the most effective treatment protocols for really all phases of COVID, including long haul and vaccine injuries.
Yeah, so FLCCC is doing really heroes work. For anyone who doesn't know FLCCC, I encourage you guys to go and follow them and look what they're doing. I think that it has become the gold standard for treatment protocols for COVID. And now, Pierre, I know you guys have a new protocol that's out addressing vaccine injured and long haul COVID, which I think is also quickly becoming the gold standard for how to treat those as well. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing now as it relates to your new protocols?
Yeah. So we had a sort of a long haul protocol that we started a year ago, and it was sort of I wouldn't say exploratory, but we kind of knew some things were working. We were starting to understand mechanisms. We had it in the fine print that it was also applicable to post-vaccine, because the thing that those two syndromes share is really the spike protein. Now, there are some differences to them, but there's also a fair amount of overlap. And then over the last year, we recognized that, the vaccine injured were presenting unique problems which needed relatively unique solutions. And so we started to kind of dig deeper in the literature, which there's a paucity of. That's the other problem. And we can go into all the problems around vaccine injury, the fact that it's not recognized, there's no post-vaccine injury clinics, there's no trials. And so these patients are really, I don't think it's too much to say that they're abandoned by the system. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of them out there. And so we, the papers that do get published, they're kind of fragmented. They're in second and third tier journals. They're usually more like basic science in vitro, like mechanistic papers. Mm-hmm. But knowing and learning more about the mechanisms and knowing the pharmacology of the different compounds and therapies that we use, we're really learning how to treat this. Now, at the same time, Laura, when I said before that we're dedicated to developing protocols, our ethos or our spirit, we've always been committed to evolving with data. As we learn, we'll change things, we'll modify doses, we'll modify priorities of things. And I will say that this protocol, I anticipate, will be adapted and edited frequently, because the amount that we're learning is really rapid. We're collaborating with physicians around the country, many of whom have actually been very experienced in the treatment of complex chronic illnesses like chronic fatigue, chronic Lyme, and things like that. And so we're learning a ton. I will say that we're really helping everyone to some degree. We can find something that works. Now, we get tremendous responses in some people, and others are a little bit more challenging. But yeah, anyway, so, Paul Marek, my partner in the FLCCC, he kind of put together like the definitive document. It has like 200 references. And we've outlined kind of treatment options or strategies. Mm-hmm. It's not so much a protocol as it's not like a rigid thing that you adhere to, but it's things that we think should be tried first line, second line, and then considered depending on patient response. And so, it's again, this virus, this spike protein, these vaccines, they're novel. Mm-hmm. They're creating illness and pathology that we're beginning to understand. We're not getting a lot of help from the medical system or certainly not from the NIH. Right. And so, we're kind of doing the best we can, but, we're committed. We understand that this is an epidemic and there's a lot of people suffering. And so we're just trying to help along with our colleagues and collaborators.
Doc, this is Carl Goldman talking, and
Hey, Carl.
at the beginning of the show, I revealed that I had the Shingrix vaccine in the fall of 2019, which is also a type of mRNA, and ended up with severe peripheral neuropathy and was in a wheelchair for a year. Now I'm in a walker. I was an avid skier before that. So I've been on a long journey for 2 years. And in the middle of that, I was on the Diamond Princess and one of the first to get COVID. So I was embedded with the CDC for a month with it while they ignored my other problem, which occurred long before COVID. My question is, since it's also an mRNA type of thing, do the therapies that you're talking about also work for someone in my condition?
So I believe they would. I mean, when you mention peripheral neuropathy, it sounds like it also affected motor function if you landed in a wheelchair, which I'm terribly saddened to hear. But, that vaccine probably also had lipid nanoparticles, because that's the other thing that we're recognizing, is that we do believe the lipid nanoparticle is also a pathogen, and it's causing diffuse inflammation. And that's the other important thing between long haul and post-vaccine. We see much more what we call neuropathic symptoms in the vaccine injured. And they truly don't fit traditional patterns. In fact, most of the neurologists who these patients see, they don't really know what to do with them. They do the standard testing, something called EMG, which looks at nerve conduction in the extremities. They'll do MRIs and CAT scans, and they don't find anything wrong. And so these patients are really not given specific therapy, but we're treating some of the immune cells that we know are activated by the spike protein and by the lipid nanoparticles. And by treating some of the inflammation, we're finding a lot of their symptoms do improve. And so I do think mechanistically, there's overlap between that vaccine and these newer ones. Again, I'd have to know a little bit more about that vaccine and what proteins it was producing. But yeah, I mean, I would imagine that we can figure out a way to treat some of the underlying disturbances.
Good. It's the paper that you've been writing and working on, is that available right now?
Yes, it's actually on our website, so it's flccc.net. If you go to protocols, we have a prevention from COVID protocol, an early treatment, a hospital, and then we have post-vaccine and long haul. And the post-vaccine is sort of a shortened document, the actual quote-unquote protocol, but we also have, we call it kind of the master guide, and that's a much longer document and goes through in much more fine detail and has all the references and our evolving understanding on that.
You mentioned that the traditional doctors kind of hit a wall with it, and I can certainly testify to that. I spent about my first 9 months of this journey. They must have done about $3.5 million of tests between Cedars, UCLA, Henry Mayo here in Santa Clarita, and then the CDC headquarters at Nebraska Medicine. They tested every single test you can possibly imagine on me, and all of it came out negative. And they did all the traditional therapies that they thought would solve the form of Guillain-Barré, or something similar to Guillain-Barré that I had. And in the end, and they consulted with the lead neurologist in Johns Hopkins at the Mayo Clinic, and all of it, because I was at the center of COVID for a while. So what their conclusion was after all this of 9 months was that I didn't have anything life-threatening, that I definitely had severe peripheral neuropathy and something similar to Guillain-Barré, and so they wanted to give me chemo. That was going to be the next step. And I'd be damned if I was going to do chemo when they didn't even know what I had. Right. So I went a different route with my recovery. But it just goes to show that the doctors really don't know how to deal with this. And as Laura and I discussed a few minutes ago, there's some devious bills here in California that may prevent even doctors like you from sharing some of the information coming forthright.
Yeah, absolutely. Carl, you mentioned something that I find really, it's very saddening, but it's really important what you just talked about, is that So the way in which I'm trying to explain why the system doctors have no ability to really assess, evaluate, and treat, particularly with these COVID vaccines, is that there's nobody who is really identifying and forming a body of science around the spike protein as the cause. I almost call it spikeopathy. And so if you don't start with that construct that there's this toxic protein that's disturbing any number of functions, if you're not taught about the mechanisms that underlie and explain, you're going to have no ability to understand this disease and how it presents. But the saddening thing is what you just talked about. So many tests are negative. And I will tell you that doctors who are so used to relying on tests to tell them what is wrong, when they're all negative, they're completely lost. And you don't fit into a traditional category. And what's so strange is we know these patients have underlying inflammation. Traditional inflammatory markers on blood tests are negative. All these imaging tests, like I talked about, and nerve conduction tests are negative. And so a lot of the patients are told that they have anxiety. Right. And or what's called a functional medical disorder, which is to say it's a somatic disorder, I mean, something that's going on in their head. And these patients are so sick and debilitated and have such diverse symptom burdens. It's actually somewhat remarkable that so many tests are negative and the patients are so sick. And I think the doctors are lost with that, but they don't understand like the conceptual framework of what is going on. Is that the spike protein is triggering lots of different abnormalities, and overall it results in a dysregulated immune system. There's persistent inflammation, there's autoimmunity, then there's clotting that's associated, there's activation of mast cells, and I could go on and on.
And I need to interrupt you because we're hitting a hard break with the news, but Dr. Pierre Corey, we'd like to invite you back again because you've got a wealth of information, and I want to thank you for your time.
Certainly.
AM 1220, FM 98.1, KHTS. Stay with us, another hour of fascinating stuff.